Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. My last video, when I talked about how Larry Kramer's death connected for me many of the issues of pandemic and deadly injustice, came out last Saturday morning. Protest had certainly already started in this country, but within hours of posting that video, the situation here intensified. On Monday evening, the president emerged from sheltering in place and threatened to engage the active military rather than just using police officers or even the National Guard against Americans. In fact, military units were immediately deployed to Washington, D.C., a city with no governor to object, as were massive artillery tank-like vehicles as well as Black Hawk helicopters. Many of us in the States feel shattered. I can't even imagine the degree of pain and fear people of color must be feeling right now. For the last few days, I've done very little. Instead of reading books and instead of sleeping, I've been constantly checking the news and refreshing Twitter, checking protests across the globe, but especially the situation in D.C., or I stare into space. I know I have a responsibility to read about the current crises we're living through, from racial injustice and police brutality to the pandemic and the course it's following, to the climate crisis, to the presidential and congressional elections, which will be held in November, to the economic collapse that these other crises might engender. It's all happening now. But I also know I need to sleep and to stop crying sometimes, at least if there's going to be any way for me to listen and hear, for me to continue to feel deep compassion, for me ever to be able to act for justice in even whatever small way I can. On Sunday night, after the sun went down and the temperatures dropped, I lay in bed with the windows opened, listening to the sounds of the military helicopters circling downtown D.C. and catching wafts of smoke, perhaps from the flashbang grenades the police were throwing to dispel protesters. Last night, I turned on my little bedroom fan just to block out the noise of the helicopters, and I picked up a powerful book of poetry, Eve Ewing's 1919, a collection of poems revolving around the race riots early in the 20th century, during the, quote, Red Summer, when riots broke out across the nation. Ewing, who is both an academic sociologist as well as a poet, looks specifically at the events in Chicago that summer. Many of us have been talking a lot about the so-called Spanish flu of 1918, and thinking about the similarities with our own time. It's a bit stunning that the 1918 flu, which continued into the first half of 1919, was in early 1919 joined by anti-Black massacres and riots throughout the United States. The riots rose to intensity a few months later. While there were many reasons for the anti-Black riots and slayings, I'm sure the tensions that came from the pandemic must have contributed. Other reasons for the race riots were complex. The Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the more urban North happened partly because of the huge need for labor in the expanding industries in the North, especially given that so many of the white workers from these cities had become soldiers in World War I. Hundreds of thousands of blacks moved north and filled those jobs at low wages, a fact that led to resentment by many working-class whites, as well as resentment by new immigrants to the cities. The situation became a powder keg when veterans began to return home to their cities, only to find that employment was hard to come by. On top of that, African Americans fought in World War I. 13% of the soldiers drafted during the war were African Americans. They served in segregated regiments under the command of white officers, often doing labor, from unloading ships of military supplies to burying the dead. Some of the black soldiers served in combat roles, too. When those soldiers came home with their uniforms and especially with their military experience, many of the whites around them, who expected blacks to behave as subordinates, were angry to see black men proudly wearing their uniforms. And many were afraid, knowing that some of those soldiers were trained in the use of weapons. Those are just some of the reasons why whites felt so uneasy and were so ready to engage in large-scale violence against blacks, especially black men. Interestingly, black resistance to the violence was also encouraged by the cultural context. Although there had been race riots before in American history, such as the horrifying 1898 riot in Wilmington, North Carolina, the 1919 riots were among the first where African Americans mounted a serious protest in return. Why did they feel able to fight back in a way that was more direct than the nation had seen before? Well, partly because of new expectations of a reduction in racism. When these soldiers came home from the war, they expected to be treated as the heroes they were. When blacks moved from the South to the North, they expected a life with less of the kinds of racial injustice they had long faced in Southern states. While segregation was not mandated in law in the Northern states, it was very much still part of the cultural expectations of white people. Still, that belief that they could have access to a world less shaped by racism and injustice surely encouraged them to speak up, to be able to resist. Ewing's book of poetry is really stunning. Earlier this year, on the recommendation of Brian at Bookish and Mark Nash, I read the phenomenal poetry collection Transcript about the Holocaust. In certain ways, this book reminds me of that one. Each of Ewing's poems begins with a section from the 1922 study, The Negro in Chicago, a study of race relations and a race riot. And each poem is written essentially in conversation with a quote from the study. No, it's not concrete poetry like Transcript is. In general, Ewing's poems are quite straightforward in their storytelling. The power of silence threads throughout as well. After one particularly devastating quote from the 1922 study, these are the words we get. There is no poem for this. It takes your breath away. There could be no more powerful poem than that. I want to mention one specific poem, the last poem in the collection. I saw Emmett Till this week at the grocery store. Emmett Till was a young black boy from Chicago visiting family in Mississippi in 1955. He was attacked and lynched by a mob after a young white woman accused him of flirting with her and making physical advances on her in a small grocery store where she worked. In recent years, she has retracted most of her testimony against Till, admitting that she was lying about claims that he had made physical advances on her. What happened to Emmett Till was plastered all over the national media, encouraging support for the burgeoning civil rights movement among both blacks and sympathetic whites. I'll provide a link to Ewing's poem in the description box, and I urge you to read it. Most of the imagery in the poem metaphorically echoes what happened to his body. If you're a fan of Allen Ginsberg's A Supermarket in California about Walt Whitman, you'll also see some resonances to that poem. For Ginsberg, Whitman is the lonely old courage teacher who perpetually stays in the present with us. For Ewing, Till shows us the danger of bruising, and yet stays upright and strong, telling us, it goes, it goes. Although Ewing really provides all the information our reader needs to know about the riot in order to understand her poetry, I do want to mention two books that provide some additional historical analysis of the Red Summer. One is A Few Red Drops, The Chicago Race Riots of 1919 by Claire Hartfield. Her book is a short narrative history of the Chicago riots, written to be accessible for middle grade and high school students. I listened to the audiobook available digitally from my library, but my understanding is that the text version has many photographs. I did not love the writing style, perhaps because the author was trying to make it highly accessible. She occasionally seemed to cross over into overly simplified narrative, which obscured her analysis. But nevertheless, I recommend the book because of Hartfield's explanations of the grounding of the riots in the events of that particular period, a period of a great deal of social and cultural change, as I mentioned before. The other historical account I want to mention is one I've not read yet, but am eager to track down, and that is Cameron McWhirter's Red Summer, the Summer of 1919 and the Awakening of Black America. McWhirter's book talks about not just Chicago, but all the similar riots across the country. From what I hear, his narrative shows how the events of that summer contributed to the rise of the civil rights movement in the coming years. Although it is a book aimed at adults, McWhirter's book is also fairly short and apparently very accessible to non-historian types. It sounds like a powerful and, of course, extremely timely read. One more recommendation. You can hear Eve Ewing read some of her own poetry and also talk about how they were constructed, what they mean to her, and what other work she does on YouTube. I've linked below down in the description box to a presentation of hers I really appreciate. I hope you'll take a listen. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.